We are in the midst of a summer sermon series on Paul's list of the fruit of the Spirit. Today we're considering generosity. Our New Testament lesson comes from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 7, verses 7 through 14. Jesus is speaking to his disciples. "Ask, and it will be given to you. Search, and you will find. Knock, and the door will be opened for you. For everyone who asks receives, and everyone who searches finds, and for everyone who knocks, the door will be opened. Is there anyone among you who, if your child asks for bread, will give a stone? Or if the child asks for a fish, will give a snake? If you then, who are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father in heaven give good things to those who ask him? In everything, do to others as you would have them do to you, for this is the law and the prophets. Enter through the narrow gate, for the gate is wide and the road is easy that leads to destruction, and there are many who take it. For the gate is narrow and the road is hard that leads to life, and there are few who find it." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. The Eagle pub in Cambridge, England, originally opened in 1667, but it is most famous for what happened there on February 28, 1953. On that day, two scientists walked into the pub at lunchtime from the Cavendish laboratory down the street where they both worked as researchers. Their names were Francis Crick and James Watson. And once inside the pub, they interrupted the lunch hour to announce that they had confirmed the double helix structure of DNA, the genetic code for all living things. Francis Crick said it this way: "We have just discovered the secret of life." Nearly 2,500 years earlier, a small group of religious scholars made a similarly radical claim when they wrote down what they believed about the origins of the universe. It was a story that they had passed down orally for centuries, but the time had come to put it into writing, to boldly state what they believed about how the world came to be. They called the book Genesis, and it began with the words, "In the beginning, God created." Have you ever wondered what prompted the people of Israel to write down these stories, to solidify them in a way which ensured they would be read and studied and interpreted by future generations? Biblical scholars now believe that the first books of the Bible were compiled during the Babylonian exile, a time of incredible suffering and upheaval for God's people. Their holy city of Jerusalem, including the temple, which was the dwelling place of God, had been destroyed, and most of the citizens deported to a foreign land. It is hard for us to imagine just how bereft and vulnerable the people of God felt. Hard for us to imagine, although there are tens of millions of refugees around our world right now who probably have a pretty good idea. To those people in that unfamiliar land, people grieving all they had lost, the leaders told stories that revealed the very nature of God, that God is inherently creative and generous toward the world and its creatures, that the ultimate meaning of creation and of life is found in the actions of the Creator, that God and God's creation are bound together in a distinctive, meaningful way, and that God created human beings uniquely in God's own image. My friend Mac was adopted as an infant. He knew this from an early age, and it never bothered him much. He had two loving parents and counted himself lucky. But a few years ago, Mac and his wife Katie had their first child, a boy, who even as an infant looked an awful lot like Mac. One night, Mac was putting the baby to bed, and over the baby monitor, Katie heard him say to his son, "You know, you are the only person I know in the whole world who looks like me. In this first story in the Bible, the first thing affirmed about God is that although God has power over all the universe, God chooses to govern the world not as a distant and demanding ruler, but as a generous, self-giving lover of creation and its creatures. God chooses to enter into relationship with God's creation and especially with humanity. As those made in God's image, as the only creatures in the world who look like God, God calls us not just to be obedient servants, but to be agents of God in the world, generous bearers of God's creativity, love, and grace. This Genesis text, written out of an experience of terror and grief, affirms that we are made in God's own image. And having been uniquely made in the image of God, we are also uniquely responsible for the world in which we live. While I was in college, some friends convinced me to run for the vice presidency of a volunteer organization that we all belong to. I was hesitant. Although I believed in the organization and its mission, I really wasn't sure it was the right thing for me to do, but finally I agreed. The first half of the term was fine. It turns out the vice president didn't have to do very much. But then one day I learned that the president had to suddenly withdraw from school. Suddenly I was the one in charge, and not just in charge, but responsible. The problem was I did not want that responsibility. I did the job as best I could, but truthfully, my best in this circumstance wasn't that great. It felt like I hadn't chosen this responsibility. It had been thrust upon me, and I did not feel equipped to do it well. To be bearers of God's image, God's generous, self-sacrificing love, God's irrational, unconditional acceptance, God's always available, over-the-top grace, this is a responsibility that can feel overwhelming. We didn't choose it, and most of us don't feel particularly equipped for this task. This is especially true when we continue to read about a world that seems to be in the midst of unprecedented upheaval. The violence and suffering and instability and fragility of this planet and its nations simply seems like too much. Too much for me, too much for you, too much even for our church community to make any kind of difference at all, whether we are made in God's image or not. But part of having been made in God's image means that we have been equipped for remarkable generosity. God's people in exile learned this not just from those stories written down in Genesis, but also from their prophets. Surely the exile felt as earth-shattering to them as the challenges of our time feel to us. At one point, the prophet Jeremiah delivers a message to God's people in exile, a message that gives them some direction in the face of this overwhelming sense that there is nothing they can do to make their situation any better. Jeremiah wrote this, "Thus says the Lord to all the exiles, build houses and live in them. Plant gardens and eat what they produce. Take wives and have sons and daughters. Take wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage, that they may bear sons and daughters. Multiply there and do not decrease. But seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare you will find your welfare." To a people longing to escape their situation, to shed their responsibility, to return to some ideal of home and the good old days, God says, you have what you need to thrive right where you are. Pay attention to the needs of those around you. Tend to the earth. Care for one another. Care for the strangers among you, even those you count as your enemies. In other words, when the world seems to be falling apart, remember who you are and in whose image you are made. When the woman walked through the doors of the church, it became immediately apparent that she had not been there in some time, if ever. For one thing, she sat in a seat that was always occupied by one of the eldest and longest term members. When that member arrived, he said nothing to the woman sitting in his seat, but climbed over her to sit further down the pew. It was a communion Sunday, and the members had a tradition of taking each element as it was passed and then waiting until everyone had been served, until they ate or drank. But as soon as the woman got her small piece of bread, she popped it in her mouth and swallowed it down. Her pewmate shot her a look, but she didn't seem to notice. When the small cups of juice came around on the shiny silver trays, she took one and drained it in one gulp, turning the cup upside down to get every last drop. At this point, the longtime member just couldn't take it anymore. "Look here," he said to the woman. "At this church, we wait until everyone has received the bread and cup, and then we eat and drink together." The woman returned his glare with a smile. "I'm so sorry, mister," she said, "but I really needed that. I just couldn't wait any longer." The challenge of generosity is that our experiences and our fears have made us much better at grasping than giving, at holding on than letting go. And we don't just struggle to be generous with our material goods. In fact, sometimes it's a lot easier to be generous financially. We also struggle to be generous with our judgment, our sympathy for what another has to bear, with our forgiveness, with our love. Too often we fail to seize the opportunities of the present, opportunities to be generous toward the person who is right in front of us at any given moment. Which is why when our fears are stirred, when our anxiety is raised, whether by the latest mass shooting, our toxic political climate, the overwhelming challenge of poverty in our own city, we need to remember the first story, which frames all of our stories. We need to remember what this story teaches us about who God is and who we are. God is the one who does not grasp, who does not hold tightly to power or self-importance, because you cannot grasp and create. You cannot grasp and be generous at the same time. In creation, God chooses not to focus on God's needs, but to give God's very self to the world and its creatures. And we are the ones made in God's image, not just given the responsibility, but the capacity to be agents of God's gracious love in the world. This is the good news embedded in the foundational story of our tradition. God's generosity empowers our generosity. Generosity is the very nature of God, which means it is our nature too. God has given us the capacity to approach the world and all the people in it with open hearts and hands, not grasping at the past or holding on to what we think is ours, but ready and willing to be generous with our time, with our resources, with our empathy, with our compassion, with our love. If you're still feeling overwhelmed by this responsibility, remember what Jesus says. We already know how to be generous. Is there anyone among you who, if your child asked for bread, would give him a stone? Of course not. This is what it means to be made in God's image. God has empowered us with the innate capacity to care for one another, family, friends, even our enemies, because God has first been generous toward us. It turns out the secret of life does not reside in our DNA, but in something much more fundamental. It cannot be seen through any microscope, but it can be seen in our actions, in how we treat one another. We are made in the image of our relentlessly generous and loving God, which means it is in our very nature to open ourselves to the world and to those who live in it with exceptional and astounding generosity. Amen.